So I have my clock running here. Every good preacher should know how long they're preaching for. Now, a dear good friend of mine who is in the near presence of the Lord always said there's two parts to every good sermon: a great beginning, a great ending, and keeping the two as close together as possible. So if you remember Monty Jones, that's some wisdom from Monty Jones. Well, it's good to be here. I'm excited. I've been working on this for some months. I'm going to be making reference to my sources up here in a second. I've laid some of the books that I used out. But just a little bit about me, if y'all weren't here for my last talk last year. I am currently the Vicar of Calvary Episcopal Church in Menard, Texas, and also the Vicar of St. James Episcopal Church at Fort McKavett, Texas. I am a 30-year veteran law enforcement officer. I retired about 3 years ago. And when I retired, that's when the bishop said, "Oh, since you're not busy anymore," and put me back at Menard and Fort McKavett. So my undergraduate I got from the great Southwest Texas State University. I have a major in history. I'm very proud of my history degree because of my professors. Many of them taught in other places, including West Point, and they often said, "Your degree is as good as anybody's, especially someone from West Point." So I'm very proud of that. And I still say Southwest Texas because that's what it says on my degree on my wall. I got my undergraduate in history and political science, and my master's is in divinity from the University of the South in Swanee, Tennessee, which some people often call the Oxford of the South. So Swanee is a beautiful place. And fortunately, I was able to do a lot of my family research and found out that my mother's family immigrated from Tennessee to Texas when they lost everything in the war of Northern aggression. So I come to you with a diverse background of indigenous persons here in Texas and West Texas, as well as Tennessee and England. And so with that, I wanted to present you this talk that I've developed. Okay, so this talk is titled "How Religion Moved Across America." In going into it, what I'm going to do is give you a broad picture of how that happened, and then narrow it down and focus about what happened here in Texas, and then specifically this part of Texas. So it'll start off very broad, and then we'll telescope it down to a more finer point. So religion moved here through many different ways. There's what I've found where there were three waves that religion came. First one, of course, we all know that rhyme that we all learned in school. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, we know that happened, and we know that through the finance of the Spanish crown that movement took place. And it was also followed up in 1531 when the Spanish further explored the East Coast from Florida all the way up to Newfoundland. The second wave came about in 1607 with the Jamestown colony. And we know that because have anybody here ever been to Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia? Yes, that was the beginning of the second wave, and really the first colonization when bricks were laid down and churches were built. That was really kind of the start. The second one we always hear about, the Mayflower and Plymouth Rock, that was in 1620. So that was the first three waves that started coming over from Europe. Just to make a real quick sketch here, it wasn't just the Pilgrims, the Spanish, and the Church of England that made that thrust. There are several other waves, and I want to do justice to that. 1524, the French started exploring this area. 1794, the Russian Orthodox Church creeped into Alaska and had established a mission in Kodiak, Alaska. Also keep in mind, in 1654, Asher Levy immigrated from Brazil with 23 Jewish persons escaping persecution in Brazil and establishing a Dutch colony in what is now known as Manhattan. Also keep in mind, in the 17 and 1800s, Islam came to the shores through enslaved persons who were Muslim from the transatlantic trade from Africa. Also in 1820, Joseph Smith had his vision, and in 1830 wrote the Book of Mormon. Now, and this is my favorite part. 1862, the Pacific Railway Act was passed. The Pacific Railway Act enabled the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, Union Pacific coming out of Omaha and Central Pacific coming out of California. And because of that, we have upwards around 15,000 Chinese immigrants coming to California to help build the Central Pacific Railroad. And with them, they brought Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. So all of this is converging on the North American continent. One of the things I like to talk about as a preacher is a story about a guy that gets stranded on an island. He gets shipwrecked. He's there for many years, and to try to maintain his sanity, he decides to try and live life as normally as he can. So he builds a commissary, he builds his house, he builds a rec room, and he builds a church. So after some 20 years, he's built himself a little village. Well, this passing ship is close enough to where the captain can look in his long glass and see, oh, there's an uncharted island, and it looks like it's inhabited. So the captain and his crew row aboard. They come ashore. They are met by this gentleman, and they said, "Oh, we saw that you have a community here. We'd like to, see if y'all need any help. Do you want to stay? Do you want to leave?" And he said, "No, I'm perfectly fine here, but I'd like to show you my town." And so he shows them commissary, his rec center, his house, and his church. And the captain said, "Oh, this is all very nice, and you're the only one here." And he said, "Yes, I'm very happy." He said, "Well, what's that building over there?" And he said, "Oh, that's where I used to go to church." So you can see how, we have many different churches for many different reasons. An interesting thing occurred in Europe. Now, as we know in Europe, a lot of churches were attached to territories, and they were state churches, state-funded churches. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555, and I'm going to mess up this Latin phrase, Curius Regio, Ilius Regio, which literally means the realm, whosever realm it is whatever religion it is. So if you were a German settler, you were probably Lutheran or Roman Catholic. If you were an English settler, you were probably bringing with you Church of England. If you were French or Spanish, you were probably bringing Roman Catholicism. And so a lot of times the settlement was tied to whoever was on the throne and what they believed. So given that, in Virginia, you have the Anglican Church, later Episcopalians. Massachusetts, you had the Puritan colonies, which were trying to reform the Church of England. In Maryland, you have the Roman Catholic Church escaping persecution of the Church of England. You have the Pennsylvania Dutch, William Penn, the Quakers, also suffering from persecution in Europe, coming over here to try to reestablish religion in what they believed. You also had the Amish, the Mennonites, and the Lutherans, all coming to this area of Pennsylvania to try to reestablish a faith in the way that they wanted to worship. North and South Carolina, you have the Scottish Presbyterians, again, escaping the Anglican persecution. There's a trend here. You have Wisconsin, Missouri, and Pennsylvania attracted a lot of German Calvinists and later Reformed Lutherans. And guess what? Utah. You had Utah with the Mormons going to Utah to escape the persecution of the East Coast. So you kind of have a trend going here. People are moving over here to try and escape persecution. So why didn't they do that in South Africa? Why didn't they do that in the Dutch Indies? Why didn't they do that in parts of Europe? There's a reason why the colonies flourish here in the United States, or at the time, North America. And what is that? Because there's a lot of room. There is a lot of space. There's a lot of acreage. There's a lot of natural resources. It drew people to different parts of North America because they could spread out. They weren't on top of each other like they were in Europe. I mean, I think if you put like the state of Texas and superimpose it in Europe, it takes up most of Europe. So could you imagine all of the population of Europe jam-packed into an area the size of Texas? I mean, everybody would be like, you'd be rubbing elbows with your neighbors and you might not like them that much. But out here, people don't speak in acres, they speak in sections. And the section is 640 acres, which is a square mile. So you had immigrants coming over and having lots of space to spread out. And of course, they probably didn't mind their neighbors were worshiping differently because they probably couldn't see their neighbors. Probably only saw each other maybe once or twice a month at the general store or the post office. So you can see how there was room to spread out here. And also, there was no real formal agreement, but really tolerance. People were able to tolerate each other because they had space. And they absolutely believed that the government didn't need to stick their nose into the church doors. A little something kind of happened in 1776. We had the American Revolution. And because of the DNA of the American fabric, all these eastern states that I just mentioned, all worshiping differently in different styles and fashions, we had religious freedom. And that's woven into who we are as Americans. Not really any other country was doing that at the time. In fact, we were probably the first nation to publicly advocate for religious freedom. James Madison, father of the Constitution, alongside Thomas Jefferson, father of the Declaration of Independence, both advocated for the separation of church and state. And it's so much a part of who we are because just think about all those different people that came over here, all the different denominational backgrounds, all fleeing Europe so they could worship the way they wanted. An interesting thing happened, and I didn't know this, and this one got by me somewhere in history, but I found out that in 1786, both Madison and Jefferson wrote and sponsored a bill called the Bill for the Establishment of Religious Liberties in 1786. This bill was backed by many evangelicals and a lot of Baptists because Baptist pastors were getting thrown in jail for preaching on the street by people in the Church of England, or the old Church of England. Now it would be probably the Episcopal Church after the American Revolution. But what this bill did, and this is what I did not know, is it stopped formal support from the Church of England to the American Episcopal churches. Going all through seminary, I'd never heard that before. And I thought, once the American Revolution happened, that was cut off, but evidently, the Church of England was still funding churches here in the United States. They were still basically state-supported churches. Now, one thing about state-supported churches is it really makes for lazy preachers. Because if you don't have to worry about who's sitting in the pew because you know your paycheck's coming in, you really get lazy. You don't take care of your congregation, you have boring sermons, you may not go visit them at the hospital. If they need help birthing a new cow, they're definitely probably going to figure out something else to do. So state-supported churches really make for lazy preachers. And that can be seen through history in many different areas. But this law was the precedent for what Madison called the Establishment Clause, what we now know as the First Amendment and the freedom of religion. So you can see how the DNA of what we are as Americans and our style of democracy and our government really made it wonderful for religion and many different denominations to flourish here in the United States like they never have in any other place. So what's going on in Texas in 1776? There's life going on here, there's active things going on here, and on the East Coast, they're fighting a war for independence. So you may stop and think, well, what was going on over here? Well, Texas was a hub of activity. The Spanish were here with the Native Americans. They were engaged in very serious evangelization and very serious colonization. The signing of the Declaration of Independence occurred in Philadelphia, but Texas was a pretty significant player because of the landscape of early America. There were Tejanos and Texans working side by side, guarding Spanish claims. They were scouting the area. There were different expeditions at that time people were exploring things. And the Spanish Empire claimed Texas as part of New Spain. And by 1776, there was about 3,000 Spanish citizens living here in Texas. So that's a pretty significant event population that's going on at the same time. One of the interesting things that I found out that I hadn't really thought about in this way, but in 1775, Spain supports the American colonies against the British. Isn't that interesting? A lot of times we don't think about the fact, we think of world wars as World War I, 1914, World War II, 1944, but the American Revolution was part of a world war. You had Spain here in Texas siding with the colonies against England. So it kind of makes for interesting bed partners when you have this dynamic going on. In June 21st, 1779, Spanish Texas here declared war on Great Britain and thus supported the American colonies. Isn't that interesting that Spanish Texas declares war on Great Britain? Bet you didn't think that anything like that was going on here in 1776, but there was. In 1783, the United States formally returns Florida to Spain as a goodwill gesture for their support in the American Revolution. We know about the French. We know about the French and how they supported, but did you ever realize or remember that Spain helped also? So these are all ties that we have that connect us to each other. So what was going on here as far as the Spanish colonies? Roman Catholicism and spirituality was seeping in here in the Concho Valley. Let me read some of these quotes I have to read because they're just better interesting. When most people imagine religion moving west, they picture a circuit rider, camp meetings, maybe a little white church on the plain. But one of the earliest Christian missionaries in Texas was founded in present-day San Angelo. And I'm going to also make a little bit of a plug here. Let me walk over. This is my Texas history book from my college days. And so I've kept it all these years. A lot of my information came out of this book as well as some others. And the co-author is sitting over here with us today, Dr. DeLeon. So little did I know that I was going to be using his textbook in a lecture 30 years later. So, so again, religion didn't just simply drift west with people. It moved with institutions and conflicts and settlements and language and empire. It drifted over, as you could kind of say. In our local area, we have a really significant beginning. Before there were settlements and presidios and missions, we had the native people of the Concho Valley. The Humanos were here, and a very significant settlement and tribal organization. They, interestingly, asked the Spanish to learn more about Christianity. And I can imagine when this probably came up, they said, wait, what, who? You already know about this? Well, of course we do. We know about it. The Blue Lady told us about it. You can imagine what the Spanish, the Roman Catholic priests and the friars are probably thinking, who is the Blue Lady? And take us to her too. So the Humanos type of spirituality was very conducive to the evangelization and the colonization of the Spanish. And that was a significant thing. They had a similar sacred understanding of place and life. And so that was a wonderful thing, that how religion started to flourish and grow right here in the Concho Valley. A gentleman by the name of Juan de las Salas, a Franciscan friar, was one of the earliest Catholics to settle this area. He established the first mission, which dates back to 1632, here again in present-day San Angelo with the Humanos. He had come down from Albuquerque, Santa Fe area and moved into Texas from the western side to this area upon hearing about this interest in Christianity. The Humanos, for years, the Indians traveled to the Pueblo country in New Mexico for trade. In 1629, they asked the Spanish to visit and to learn more about the Blue Lady. This was perhaps one of the most interesting stories in our movement of religion across America, because little did we know it was already there. By a miraculous bilocation of the Blue Lady, sometimes I hear people say, well, God's been nowhere near Big Lake, Texas, or God's been nowhere near New Braunfels, Texas. And so some people might say, well, God's been nowhere near the Concho Valley. This would argue that. God goes where God wants to go. So it's neat and interesting to see how this all started to coming into place. The first Christian chapter in our part of Texas was not a cathedral, it was a fragile mission on the edge of a vast land. 1682, La Salle claimed the entire Mississippi Valley for Spain. Now, that's a lot. That's like, wouldn't you like it if somebody showed up and said, this is ours? Do you have a flag? And he tried to make good on that. He came back 2 years later and missed the mouth of the Mississippi River and ended up in Matagorda Bay. Now, I've been to both, and I know what that looks like. How did you miss that? But he brought French colonialism and the Roman Catholic faith to that area in Matagorda Bay. And it's interesting to see, again, these little pockets of faith sprouting up along the Texas coast, or maybe out in West Texas. The Spanish had eventually had to abandon a lot of these missions. By 1772, the Spanish crown had said, we just can't keep this up. So they went into a system of what they call secularization, where the missions were eventually turned over to local parishes and moved away from state-supported religion. But the faith and the people and the systems remained and grew into what we now know and have as the Roman Catholic Church of Texas. All this was completed by about 1821. In the boundaries, in the borderlands, the regions were never really about heaven. A lot of times they were about who could shape the future. So with the empires came the religion, and with that, they were trying to shape their empire, shape their territories. But regardless, the church came and stayed and growed. Now, this is a little bit of a diversion from colonial America. We're going to fast forward about 200 years. And when we talked about how did religion move across America, it's an interesting thing, because if the Franciscan missions showed how religion arrived by the trail and personal encounter, the Baptist chapel cars showed religion arriving by timetable and rail sightings. So many of you know that I'm also a big railroad person, the president of the Railway Museum of San Angelo, and model railroading and railroad history is very, very dear to me. So one of my other sources is this book right here. It's called This Train is Bound for Glory, The Story of American Railroad Chapel Cars. So this is a big book, and I tried to just find one little spot in here to talk about how religion moved across America, and it moved by railroads. So I found a specific Baptist railroad chapel car called, I just lost the name of it, called the Goodwill. The Baptist church, the Baptist church in America had 7 chapel cars. This one was chapel car number 4. And I picked it mainly because it hung around Texas a lot. It was purchased and built in 1895. The Texas Baptist Convention were the ones that chartered this to be constructed and built, and it went literally all over the place. It went to Texarkana, it went to Denison, it traveled through the El Llano Estacado, was in Marshall, Texas, Del Rio, Galveston. It went all over, and it had a vast number of pastors, Baptist pastors, that were in charge of maintaining and keeping it. This served as a rolling church to places that had no church. Now, we often hear about the Methodist circuit riders, about how they would literally spend an entire month making their routes. The Baptists tried to do the same thing, but with chapel cars. So it was neat to read about some of these pastors that were passionate about it. There's even a letter that I found from the secretary of the Southern Baptist Convention warning in a very polite way the current pastor of Chapel Car number 4, the Good Hope. And he said, "We do not want to take advantage of the railroad. They have been very good to us. They let us take our chapel car behind most of their trains, but be careful not to let unauthorized persons ride in the chapel cars while in motion. The railroad's giving us the service for free, and we don't need to freeload off them. So if you travel, buy a ticket." So I thought it was pretty neat to have that they, I didn't know that. I would assume the pastor and his family rode in the coach. They had to buy regular tickets and ride in the regular coaches behind the train. So it was a nice symbiotic agreement that the railroads didn't charge to have these chapel cars pulled behind them. Now, if we tried to do that today with Amtrak, that's not going to work, because I've asked and they said no. But this chapel car was interesting in the sense that it carried many different, very interesting personalities, which I'm not going to go into because I'm keeping track of my time. But one of the significant things is one of the pastors took a call to the church in Waco in summer of 1900. A new pastor had been appointed, and the chapel car ended up in Galveston in the summer of 1900. It was getting some work on the brakes. It was getting its wheels returned. It was having some windows replaced. And guess what happened September 8th and 9th, 1900? The great storm of Galveston hit. This is more or less a miraculous story about this chapel car, the Goodwill. As several people saw and were starting to get a sense of the weather, one of the local hostlers, which is the men that move the locomotives around in the yard, decided to put the chapel car in one of the car shops, which is a building about like this. They push it into one of these shops, and he parks a steam engine, a large steam engine, on the side of it to guard it from the ocean side. And so as it happens, we know that the island was devastated. Almost every single building was destroyed or seriously damaged. All 4 Baptist churches were destroyed. Even the family of one of the Baptist pastors was totally carried out to sea. It was an unbelievable tragedy. But miraculously, the shops that this coach was parked in were destroyed, except the shop where that chapel car was parked in. The roof that directly covered it was slightly damaged. Some of the walls had extreme water damage, but the car had very, very minimal damage. So the Goodwill became not only just a refuge for grief and recovery, but it became the spiritual center of the recovery of Galveston, and it also became a respite for people in need of blankets, of water, medical supplies. It really became a car of refuge. So I thought that was pretty interesting about this railroad chapel car. In the late 1900s, the religion in West Texas was no longer passing through. It was beginning to settle and organize and form communities. Fort Concho was part of that. In 1867, it not only just protected the frontier, but it also imposed a sense of order to this unruly part of Texas with these ruffians and bandits. The fort did more than just build horse soldiers. It built community. It built community centers. Even the chaplains here assigned to Fort Concho provided pastoral care. And many of them were the early teachers for the schools in this area. They were a part of the very fabric of San Angelo, these early Army chaplains. Even Norman Badger was an Episcopal Army chaplain, held the first service for the Episcopal Church in this area. And we all know about Fighting Jack Potter, the Methodist gun-toting preacher. He was the beginning of the Methodist Church here, and the first the first Adobe Catholic Church is noted as being the first worship place here in San Angelo. So not only was it Catholic roots and Protestant growth, but all of these things combined together to give us what we now know as the religion here in West Texas. And we see how this same thing moved from the East Coast to the West Coast, leapfrogging town by town, being on rails or horseback, or from army post to army post is how religion moved across the United States. We ask, how did religion move across? The answer is not simply that it moved from east to west in our part of Texas. It came by Spanish mission, native encounter, military post, preachers, settlers, even by rail. And so religion moved across and flourished, not because government established it, but because in America, people wanted to freely seek God in the way that they felt led to. Amen. Any questions? 12:45. This is the, I forgot about PowerPoint, but I can pass this around and y'all can look at it. This is the inside of one of the chapel cars, which you can tell it's just set up for worship style. I mean, you have the seats, as they're facing and all pointing up to the front towards the altar. So I thought that was pretty neat. I could not find a picture of the Goodwill, but I did find a picture of, I think this one is a Hope. So this is one of the Baptist chapel cars, which they were just, as I've learned more about them, I've become more fascinated with them. And other denominations had chapel cars. This one is a Roman Catholic Church chapel car. The joke in the Episcopal Church has always been, well, how did the West get settled? Well, the Spanish came out and did missionary work with the Indians, and then the Baptists and the Methodists came out and did their circuit riding, and the Episcopalians didn't show up till it was a first-class Pullman coach on the Southern Pacific. And I didn't go into detail about that, but they would uncouple from the train. They would literally sit on a siding. In some cases, they would sit in the railroad yard, like around the roundhouse or the freight station, and they would be there for up to 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes a month. One of the Baptist pastors talked about in Denison at the Katy Railroad Yard, Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad Yard. It stayed there for about a month, and he had somewhere around 80 baptisms, and they were pretty much all railroad employees or railroad families. There was another camp settlement on the Goodwill, and I believe it was in Marshall, Texas. And the pastor of the railroad chapel car at the time said, everybody's welcome. And they had set up tents, and he recorded about 2,000 people coming to and he said all denominations were attended and were invited to have a large celebration. So these events touched many, many lives. They were, a lot of times they were Christian education. They brought medical supplies. Usually the spouse of the pastor would teach catechism to the kids. So songs, music, worship. A lot of people didn't have Bibles. So they had scripture cards to where they could hand out and give to people that didn't have Bibles. So it was just a great way of reaching out to people. And some of these towns had no churches at all. And so a lot of times, people would just say, well, any church is good enough for me, and they would go. These doors are open. So it was just a really significant event in history that, until I found this book, I was not aware of.
Talk about the blue lady.
The blue lady. The lady in blue. You've got that, and I have some of my notes. I have the name of the lady that they suspect was the original apparition for her. And I like I said, I was trying to stick to time. It was a Spanish nun. Her name was Madre Maria Agreda. Agreda, is that correct? That she was in Europe. And they believe that that was the apparition of the Blue Lady. She bilocated. For any of you that may be familiar, like with Padre Pio in Italy, he would show up in different places at different times when they knew he was back over there. Well, she did the same thing, and she manifested in several different places to the Humanos in several different areas here in this part of the Concho Valley. And you know, when the Spanish showed up and they were thinking that they were going to be, hey, I want to tell you about Jesus Christ, and they already knew about that, which was miraculous. I think if that was me, I'd probably be like, "Whoa, this is scary."